By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive turning point. After years of brutal island-by-island fighting, Allied strategy shifted from gradual advance to direct confrontation with Japan's remaining core defenses. At the center of this new phase stood the Philippines, a territory whose importance was strategic, symbolic, and personal. For the United States, the Philippines were more than a battlefield. They were an American commonwealth, abandoned during the dark days of 1942. General Douglas MacArthur's vow, "I shall return," had become a promise not only to the Filipino people, but to American morale itself. By 1944, that promise was ready to be fulfilled. Strategically, the Philippines were critical to Japan's survival. The islands sat astride the main sea lanes connecting Japan to Southeast Asia and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. As long as Japan controlled the Philippines, its fleet and industry retained access to vital fuel and resources. Losing them would sever that lifeline and isolate the Japanese home islands from the south. On October 20th, 1944, Allied forces landed on the island of Leyte. The scale of the operation was immense. Hundreds of warships, thousands of aircraft, and more than 200,000 troops were committed to the invasion. Never before had such a concentration of naval power been assembled in the Pacific. The beaches of Leyte became the focal point of a campaign intended to break Japan's ability to continue the war. Japanese leaders immediately understood the threat. This was not another raid or limited operation. If Leyte was lost, the Philippines would fall. If the Philippines fell, Japan's empire would be strategically crippled. There could be no retreat, no delay, no conservation of forces. What followed was Japan's final attempt to reverse the course of the war at sea. A desperate, complex plan was set in motion, one that would commit nearly every remaining major warship Japan possessed. The coming battle would unfold across vast distances in multiple engagements over several days. It would not be a single clash, but a catastrophe in slow motion. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin, the largest naval battle the world had ever seen. Faced with the Allied landing on Leyte, Japan's naval leadership understood that the moment they had feared had arrived. This was not simply another battle. It was a fight for survival. If the Philippines were lost, Japan's access to oil, raw materials, and reinforcement routes from Southeast Asia would be cut almost entirely. Without fuel, Japan's Navy and Air Force would become irrelevant. There would be no second chance. In response, Japanese planners activated Operation Shō-Gō, a desperate and extraordinarily complex plan designed to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. It was a gamble born of necessity rather than confidence. Japan no longer had the industrial capacity, fuel reserves, or trained pilots to fight a prolonged naval war. Victory had to be decisive, or there would be no victory at all. The plan relied on deception, sacrifice, and coordination across vast distances. Japanese forces were divided into multiple task groups, each with a specific role. A decoy carrier force, largely stripped of experienced pilots, would lure the powerful U.S. Third Fleet away from Leyte. Meanwhile, heavily armed surface fleets would attempt to penetrate the invasion area from different directions and attack vulnerable transport ships and escort carriers supporting the landings. It was an audacious strategy, but also a dangerous one. Japanese ships would operate with limited air cover, minimal fuel reserves, and little margin for error. Communication between task forces was fragile. Timing had to be precise. If any element failed, the entire plan could collapse. Perhaps most telling was what Operation Shō-Gō revealed about Japan's situation. Aircraft carriers, once the heart of Japanese naval power, were now being used as bait. Battleships and cruisers were sent forward on near-suicidal missions. Commanders accepted that losses would be catastrophic. The goal was no longer preservation of the fleet, but the destruction of the enemy at any cost. American commanders, unaware of the full details of the plan, nevertheless sensed Japanese desperation. Intelligence reports indicated large-scale fleet movements. Something major was coming. But few anticipated just how many ships Japan was willing to commit, or how fragmented and chaotic the coming battle would become. Operation Shō-Gō was Japan's final roll of the dice at sea. It was a plan that demanded sacrifice, embraced risk, and offered only one possible reward: the chance to change the course of the war. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike anything before it. Unlike most great naval engagements, the Battle of Leyte Gulf did not unfold as a single, unified clash. It emerged instead as a series of separate, overlapping battles spread across hundreds of miles of ocean and several days of chaos. This fragmentation was not planned by either side, but it became the defining feature of the largest naval battle in history. As Japanese task forces advanced toward the Philippines, they did so from multiple directions and under vastly different conditions. Some sailed through narrow straits under constant threat of air attack. Others moved in open seas with little situational awareness. Communication between Japanese commanders was unreliable, often delayed or non-existent. Each force operated with only partial knowledge of where the others were, or whether they were still alive. American forces faced their own challenges. The sheer scale of the Allied fleet made centralized control difficult. Carrier groups, battleships, escort carriers, and invasion transports were spread across vast areas. Decisions were made based on incomplete reports, radar contacts, and rapidly changing intelligence. Admirals were forced to act independently, often without knowing the full picture. This disjointed nature meant that Leyte Gulf became not one battle, but several battles happening almost simultaneously, each with its own commanders, dangers, and consequences. Ships fought without knowing whether help was coming. Aircraft launched strikes against enemies they only partially understood. Critical decisions were made under intense pressure, sometimes with irreversible consequences. The fog of war was extreme. Reports of enemy carriers, battleships, and cruisers flooded command centers, some accurate, many not. American commanders believed at times that Japanese carrier strength was far greater than it actually was. Japanese commanders, meanwhile, often underestimated the number of U.S. ships blocking their path. Both sides were reacting to shadows as much as to reality. This fragmentation favored the side with greater flexibility, air power, and logistical depth. The United States could absorb confusion, replace losses, and adjust tactics rapidly. Japan could not. Each mistake carried disproportionate weight. Each lost ship couldn't be easily replaced. As a result, Leyte Gulf evolved into a battle of endurance, adaptation, and survival, rather than a single decisive blow. Victory would not be determined by one dramatic moment, but by how each side responded to chaos over time. The world's largest naval battle was not fought as a grand clash of fleets, but as a series of violent collisions, miscalculations, and desperate gambles across the Philippine Sea. And the first of those collisions was about to begin. By October 1944, Japan's strategic situation had become desperate. Years of attrition had stripped the Imperial Navy of experienced pilots. Fuel reserves were critically low, and American industrial power had tilted the balance of the war beyond recovery. The Allied landings on Leyte were not just another invasion, they were an existential threat. If the Philippines were lost, Japan would be cut off from vital oil supplies in Southeast Asia, strangling its ability to continue the war. Faced with this reality, Japanese naval leadership abandoned conventional thinking. Rather than preserve what remained of the fleet, they chose to risk everything in a single, all-or-nothing operation. The plan was known as Shō-Gō, or Victory Operation. It was not designed for long-term success. It was designed to gamble the entire Imperial Navy on one decisive strike, regardless of losses. The strategy relied on deception and sacrifice. Japanese carrier forces, once the pride of the Navy, were now dangerously weakened. Many carriers had few aircraft and even fewer trained pilots. Yet these carriers would serve as bait, deliberately drawing American fast carrier forces away from Leyte. While U.S. commanders focused on the apparent carrier threat to the north, powerful surface fleets would slip through narrow straits and attack the vulnerable invasion transports directly. It was a plan built on assumptions and desperation. Japanese commanders knew their chances were slim. Fuel shortages meant ships would sail with barely enough reserves for the operation. Air cover would be minimal. Coordination between forces depended on timing that could not be guaranteed. Communication systems were outdated and vulnerable. But Shō-Gō represented the last opportunity to strike a catastrophic blow against Allied forces. What made the plan especially dangerous was its complexity. Multiple task forces would converge from different directions, through the Sibuyan Sea, through the Surigao Strait, and from the north. Each force had a specific role, and failure by anyone could doom the entire operation. There was no margin for error. Yet the Japanese leadership accepted the risk. Better, they believed, to lose everything in one final effort than to surrender the initiative without a fight. Honor, doctrine, and desperation merged into a single decision. As Japanese ships weighed anchor and began moving toward the Philippines, the fate of the Imperial Navy was already sealed, though no one yet knew how, where, or when the final blows would fall. The gamble had begun. As Japanese forces set Shō-Gō in motion, the waters surrounding the Philippines quietly transformed into one of the most complex naval traps ever attempted. By mid-October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was no longer a single engagement waiting to happen. It was a vast, unfolding operation, stretching across hundreds of miles of ocean, involving dozens of fleets, task forces, and air groups moving toward collision. The Allied landings on Leyte had begun on October 20th, supported by overwhelming naval power. Hundreds of transports crowded the waters of Leyte Gulf, unloading troops, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies. From the American perspective, the invasion appeared well protected. Fast carrier task forces roamed nearby seas, battleships and cruisers stood ready, and air superiority seemed secure. Yet beneath this apparent control lay dangerous assumptions. American commanders believed Japan's remaining naval strength was fragmented and incapable of coordinated action. Years of victories had reinforced confidence that the Imperial Navy could no longer mount a large-scale offensive. This belief shaped decisions in the critical days that followed. Unbeknownst to the Allies, Japanese forces were already converging. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita led the most powerful formation, Center Force, through the Cebuyan Sea. It included massive battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, among them the super battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. This force represented Japan's remaining surface striking power. Its mission was clear: break through American defenses and attack the invasion fleet at Leyte directly. To the south, another Japanese force prepared to advance through the narrow Surigao Strait, approaching from a direction the Americans considered less dangerous. To the north, decoy carrier forces moved deliberately into position, broadcasting their presence and inviting pursuit. The geography of the Philippines magnified the danger. Narrow straits, confined seas, and poor visibility limited reconnaissance and complicated command decisions. Fleets could vanish behind islands, reappear unexpectedly, or slip past defensive screens under cover of darkness. Information traveled slowly, filtered through fragmented reports and delayed signals. For American commanders, the challenge was not a lack of power, but the difficulty of knowing where to apply it. As reports of Japanese movements began to arrive, they were incomplete and often contradictory. Sightings were misidentified, timelines overlapped. Some commanders believed the Japanese were retreating, others suspected a diversion. No single picture of the battlefield existed. The stage was set for confusion on a massive scale. As night fell and fleets continued to maneuver unseen, the Philippine seas filled with warships moving toward history's largest naval battle, one that would not unfold as a single clash, but as a series of violent, interconnected confrontations across multiple fronts. The trap was forming, and both sides were already inside it. At the heart of Japan's Shō-Gō plan lay a gamble so audacious that it bordered on desperation. With their carrier air power shattered after years of losses, Japanese naval leaders chose to use their remaining aircraft carriers not as striking weapons, but as bait. This decision would shape the entire course of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the northern force. His fleet included Japan's last operational aircraft carriers, among them Zuikaku, the final survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. But these ships were shadows of their former strength. Their air groups were dangerously undertrained, their aircraft few in number, and their pilots largely inexperienced. Ozawa knew the truth. His carriers could not survive a direct fight with American fast carrier forces. They were never meant to. Ozawa's mission was to lure Admiral William Bull Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte. By presenting his carriers as a threat, Ozawa hoped to draw American attention northward, clearing a path for Kurita's battleships to strike the vulnerable invasion fleet from the west. It was a strategy built entirely on psychology, on the expectation that American commanders would instinctively pursue carriers above all else. That expectation was not unreasonable. For 2 years, U.S. naval doctrine had treated enemy carriers as the primary targets in any engagement. Carriers represented air power, mobility, and strategic reach. Destroying them meant crippling Japan's ability to fight at sea. Halsey, aggressive and confident, had built his reputation on bold carrier strikes. The opportunity to eliminate Japan's remaining carriers was exactly the kind of battle he sought. On October 24th, reports reached Halsey that a Japanese carrier force had been sighted to the north. Almost immediately, the possibility of a decisive carrier engagement dominated his thinking. The danger posed by Kurita's surface force appeared diminished, especially after American air attacks in the Cebuyan Sea damaged and temporarily drove it back. What Halsey did not know was that Kurita had not retreated. He had only paused. As night fell, Ozawa's decoy fleet continued broadcasting its position, making no attempt to hide. It was a deliberate invitation, and Halsey accepted it. He ordered the bulk of the Third Fleet northward in pursuit, taking with him the fast battleships and carriers that could have blocked Kurita's advance. In doing so, he left the San Bernardino Strait, one of the key approaches to Leyte, unguarded. The decoy had worked. Ozawa's carriers were sailing toward destruction, but they had achieved their purpose. The American fleet had been pulled away at exactly the wrong moment, opening a path for Japan's most powerful surface force to slip through. The battle was about to fracture into chaos, and the most dangerous phase was just beginning. As Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet raced north in pursuit of Ozawa's decoy carriers, a critical gap opened in the American defensive screen, one that would have catastrophic consequences. The San Bernardino Strait, a narrow passage between the Philippine Islands, lay almost completely unguarded. Through it, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force was moving silently toward Leyte. Kurita's fleet was the most heavily armed surface force Japan had ever assembled. It included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, armed with the largest naval guns ever put to sea, along with heavy cruisers and destroyers. Earlier American air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea had inflicted losses, including the sinking of Musashi, and temporarily forced Kurita to turn back. To American commanders, it appeared that the threat had been neutralized. It had not. Under cover of darkness, Kurita reversed course. His ships passed through the San Bernardino Strait during the night of October 24th to 25th without opposition. There were no American battleships waiting, no carrier air patrols overhead, no warning shots fired. One of the most powerful naval forces in history slipped through a vital choke point unchallenged. Their escort carriers were lightly armed, slow, and designed to provide close air support for troops ashore. Their destroyers and destroyer escorts were thin-skinned ships built for anti-submarine warfare, not surface combat. At dawn on October 25th, Kurita's fleet emerged from the strait and sighted Taffy 3 off Samar. What followed defied every expectation of naval warfare. The Japanese battleships opened fire at extreme range, their massive shells splashing around tiny American carriers that had no business being there. For the sailors of Taffy 3, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. They were facing an enemy force that outgunned them by orders of magnitude. Yet retreat was not an option. If Kurita broke through, the invasion fleet, thousands of soldiers, supply ships, and transports would be slaughtered at anchor. The success of the entire Leyte operation and MacArthur's return to the Philippines hung in the balance. Against logic, doctrine, and probability, the outmatched American escort carriers and destroyers turned to fight. The largest naval battle in history had reached its most desperate moment, not in a clash of giants, but in a confrontation between the powerful and the hopelessly outgunned, where survival depended not on strength, but on courage, confusion, and sheer will. The battle off Samar was about to begin. At dawn on October 25th, 1944, the sailors of Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, found themselves facing annihilation. Mist and low clouds lifted to reveal the impossible. Japanese battleships and cruisers advancing directly toward them. Massive shells from Kurita's fleet began to fall among the small escort carriers, sending towering columns of water into the air. The sound alone was terrifying, deep, thunderous detonations from guns designed to destroy capital ships. Taffy 3 was never meant to fight a surface fleet. Its 6 escort carriers were slow, lightly armored, and armed mainly with aircraft intended for ground support. Their decks carried a mix of fighters and lightly armed bombers, many loaded with depth charges or rockets, rather than armor-piercing bombs. The accompanying destroyers and destroyer escorts were thin-skinned vessels whose largest guns were insignificant compared to the massive batteries of Yamato and her escorts. Yet retreat would mean disaster. Behind Taffy 3 lay the invasion fleet at Leyte, hundreds of transports, supply ships, and landing craft packed with troops and equipment. If Kurita reached them, the invasion could collapse in hours. With no time to wait for help and no expectation of survival, the American commanders made a decision that would define the battle. They attacked. American destroyers charged directly toward the Japanese line, laying smoke screens to shield the carriers and firing torpedoes at point-blank range. Ships like USS Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts raced forward into overwhelming gunfire. They maneuvered aggressively, zigzagging at full speed, closing the distance against battleships that outweighed them by tens of thousands of tons. The sky filled with American aircraft launching from the escort carriers. Pilots attacked again and again, even when their planes carried no effective anti-ship weapons. Some strafed with machine guns. Others dropped depth charges or empty fuel tanks to give the impression of heavier attacks. Every strike was designed to confuse, delay, and intimidate the enemy. Japanese gunners struggled to identify targets through smoke and rain squalls. Reports of torpedo hits, air attacks, and aggressive maneuvering created the illusion that they were facing a much larger American force. Kurita's ships began to maneuver defensively, breaking formation and losing coordination. One by one, American ships were hit. USS Johnston was torn apart by heavy shells, but continued fighting until she sank. USS Hole charged into gunfire and disappeared beneath the waves. USS Samuel B. Roberts fought so fiercely that survivors later said she seemed to attack like a cruiser. Escort carriers were struck, burning, listing, and barely able to maintain speed. By all logic, Taffy 3 should have been destroyed. Instead, their reckless aggression, constant air attacks, and refusal to break shattered Japanese confidence. Kurita, uncertain of American strength and fearing further losses, began to withdraw. Against every expectation, the weakest force on the battlefield had stopped the strongest. The Battle off Samar would become one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in naval history, a moment where bravery, confusion, and sacrifice changed the course of the largest naval battle ever fought. As the morning battle off Samar descended into chaos, Admiral Takeo Kurita faced a decision that would haunt Japanese naval history. What had begun as a clear opportunity to destroy vulnerable American escort carriers and smash the Leyte invasion fleet had transformed into a confusing, violent struggle against an enemy that refused to behave as expected. Kurita's center force was still powerful on paper. Battleships, including the colossal Yamato, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, remained operational. American losses were mounting. Several escort carriers were burning. Destroyers had been sunk. And yet, the situation felt increasingly unstable. Reports flooding Kurita's flagship were contradictory and alarming. Japanese crews reported relentless air attacks from all directions. Torpedo warnings forced battleships and cruisers into constant evasive maneuvers, breaking formation and disrupting fire control. Smoke screens obscured targets. American aircraft appeared to attack without pause, giving the impression of far greater carrier strength than actually existed. Some officers became convinced they were facing fleet carriers, not escort carriers. Communication breakdowns worsened the confusion. Kurita had already lost several heavy cruisers earlier in the battle to submarine and air attack. He was painfully aware that Japanese naval losses could not be replaced. Every damaged ship represented a permanent reduction in Japan's remaining power. The center force had entered the battle without air cover, relying entirely on anti-aircraft guns and maneuvering to survive repeated strikes. At the same time, Kurita lacked a clear picture of the wider battle. He did not know that the Japanese southern force had been annihilated in Surigao Strait. He did not know that Halsey's powerful Third Fleet was far to the north, chasing decoys. What he did know was that American resistance was far fiercer than expected, and that his fleet was becoming increasingly disorganized under attack. The purpose of the operation had been decisive destruction, not attrition. Kurita began to question whether pressing forward would actually achieve Japan's strategic goals. Even if he reached the invasion transports, his ships would be exposed to continuous air attack with no guarantee of escape. Damage would accumulate. Losses would mount. And there was a growing fear that stronger American forces were closing in. Shortly after mid-morning, Kurita made the fateful decision. He ordered the center force to disengage. Japanese ships began turning north, breaking contact with Taffy 3 and withdrawing from the battlefield. American sailors watched in disbelief as the massive silhouettes on the horizon slowly pulled away. Against all odds, the invasion fleet at Leyte had been spared. Kurita's withdrawal marked the collapse of Japan's final opportunity to defeat the Allied landing. The largest naval battle in history had reached its turning point, not through overwhelming firepower, but through confusion, exhaustion, and the relentless pressure of men who refused to yield. The decision ended the battle off Samar, and with it, Japan's last realistic chance to alter the course of the Pacific War. When the guns finally fell silent across the waters of Leyte Gulf, the scale of what had occurred began to sink in. The battle was not a single engagement, but a sprawling series of clashes across hundreds of miles of ocean, Sibuyan Sea, Surigao Strait, off Samar, and Cape Engano. Together they formed the largest naval battle in history, and its outcome was devastating for Japan. In material terms, the losses were catastrophic. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Many of these ships represented the last operational remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy's once formidable surface fleet. Even more damaging than the ships themselves was the loss of experienced crews, sailors, engineers, gunners, and officers whose training and experience could not be replaced. The carriers lost at Cape Engano were especially symbolic. Though used as decoys, they represented Japan's final carrier force. Their air groups were already depleted, their pilots largely inexperienced. With their destruction, Japan effectively ceased to be a carrier power. The era that had begun with Pearl Harbor ended at Leyte Gulf. American losses, while not insignificant, told a very different story. Several escort carriers and destroyers were sunk, particularly during the desperate fighting off Samar. Thousands of American sailors were killed. But these losses were absorbed by an industrial system operating at full capacity. Ships could be replaced, crews could be trained, damage could be repaired. The imbalance between the two nations had become overwhelming. Strategically, Leyte Gulf sealed Japan's fate. The failure to destroy the invasion fleet meant the loss of the Philippines. With that loss, Japan was cut off from vital oil supplies in Southeast Asia. Fuel shortages crippled remaining naval and air operations. Training flights were reduced or canceled. Ships remained in port, unable to sail. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. From this point forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer an offensive force. It existed only as a shadow, capable of isolated actions, but incapable of influencing the course of the war. Surface battles on a meaningful scale would never occur again. Leyte Gulf marked the moment when naval power in the Pacific became absolute and irreversible. The United States and its allies now controlled the seas. Amphibious landings could proceed without serious naval opposition. Supply lines were secure. Japan's home islands were exposed. The largest naval battle in history was also its final verdict. After Leyte Gulf, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer in doubt. What remained was not the question of victory, but the cost at which the war would finally end. In the weeks following the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the reality facing Japan's naval leadership became impossible to ignore. The Imperial Japanese Navy still existed on paper, but in practice, it had lost the ability to function as a true fighting force. Leyte Gulf had not merely defeated Japan at sea, it had removed the Navy from the war as an effective instrument. The most immediate problem was fuel. Japan's strategy had depended on access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. Leyte Gulf coincided with the Allied reconquest of the Philippines, severing the sea routes that connected Japan to these vital resources. Tankers were sunk faster than they could be replaced. What little fuel reached Japan was reserved for homeland defense, leaving most surviving warships stranded in port. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers sat idle, not because they were undamaged, but because they could not sail. Even training became impossible. Pilots received fewer and fewer flight hours as aviation fuel disappeared. Naval crews drilled on deck without ever leaving harbor. Machinery deteriorated from lack of use. Morale collapsed as sailors realized they were preparing for missions that would never come. The Navy, that had once dominated the Pacific, now existed largely as a stationary force, watching the war slip beyond its reach. Commanders understood the implications. Without fuel, without air cover, and without replacement crews, any attempt to challenge Allied naval power would result in annihilation. The lessons of Leyte Gulf were clear. Surface fleets could not operate without air superiority, logistics, and industrial support. Japan had lost all three. From this point forward, Japanese naval planning shifted from victory to desperation. Rather than decisive battles, the Navy prepared for symbolic actions, missions intended to delay, disrupt, or sacrifice ships for political or psychological effect. The concept of survival gave way to the concept of honorable destruction. The Navy no longer existed to win the war, but to die in a way that preserved national pride. This transformation was profound. It marked the end of Japan's naval doctrine as it had existed since the early 20th century. The idea of a climactic fleet engagement, long central to Japanese strategy, had been tested at Leyte Gulf and found fatally flawed. For the Allies, the meaning was equally clear. With Japan's navy neutralized, the seas of the Western Pacific were effectively uncontested. Amphibious operations could advance toward Okinawa and beyond. Supply convoys moved with increasing confidence. The war had entered its final phase. Leyte Gulf did not simply destroy ships. It destroyed Japan's ability to fight at sea. And once that ability was gone, The end of the Pacific War became a matter of time rather than possibility. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the final collapse of a belief that had shaped naval warfare for generations, the idea that battleships were the ultimate arbiters of power at sea. For decades, navies around the world had been built around massive guns, thick armor, and decisive surface engagements. Leyte Gulf exposed this doctrine as not just outdated, but dangerously irrelevant. During the battle, Japan committed its remaining battleships in one last attempt to reverse the course of the war. These ships represented enormous investments of steel, manpower, and national pride. Yet their fate was determined not by other battleships, but by aircraft. Repeatedly, capital ships were attacked from the air, struck by bombs and torpedoes launched far beyond the reach of their guns. Armor that could withstand shell fire proved vulnerable to attacks from above and below. The destruction of battleships at Leyte Gulf was not sudden, but systematic. Air superiority dictated movement. Ships without air cover were exposed, tracked, and destroyed at will. Even when battleships survived initial strikes, they were rendered operationally useless, damaged, slowed, or forced to retreat under constant threat. Firepower no longer mattered if a ship could not reach the battlefield or survive long enough to use it. For Japanese commanders, this reality was devastating. The fleet had been designed for a climactic surface battle, a decisive encounter where skill, gunnery, and courage would determine the outcome. Leyte Gulf never became that battle. Instead, it fragmented into a series of engagements dominated by carrier aircraft, submarines, and overwhelming Allied coordination. The long-awaited decisive battle dissolved into chaos. The implications extended far beyond Japan. Leyte Gulf confirmed beyond any doubt that the aircraft carrier, not the battleship, was now the central instrument of naval power. Control of the air determined control of the sea. Fleet engagements would no longer be decided by who had the largest guns, but by who could locate the enemy first, launch aircraft faster, and protect their own carriers more effectively. Naval warfare had crossed a point of no return. After Leyte Gulf, battleships would continue to serve, but never again as the primary force deciding wars at sea. Their era had ended quietly, not with a single dramatic duel, but through repeated demonstrations of vulnerability. The future belonged to air power, logistics, intelligence, and coordination. Leyte Gulf did not just conclude the largest naval battle in history, it closed the final chapter of the battleship age and opened the modern era of naval warfare for good. By October 1944, Japan's strategic situation had become desperate. Its navy, once dominant across the Pacific, had been shattered by years of attrition. Aircraft carriers were sunk or damaged. Experienced pilots were gone, replaced by inadequately trained crews. Fuel shortages, limited training, and restricted fleet movement. Yet despite these crippling losses, Japan's leadership committed to one final all-or-nothing gamble at Leyte Gulf. The plan was born not from confidence but from necessity. The American landings on Leyte threatened Japan's entire position in the Philippines. If the islands were lost, Japan would be cut off from vital oil supplies in Southeast Asia. Without fuel, the remaining fleet, air force, and industry would grind to a halt. For Japanese planners, allowing Leyte to fall without a decisive response was unthinkable, even if the odds were catastrophic. The resulting operation was extraordinarily complex. Japanese forces were divided into multiple task groups, approaching from different directions in an attempt to confuse and overwhelm the Allies. A northern force, built around Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, was deliberately sacrificed as bait. Its role was not to fight, but to draw American carrier forces away from Leyte. Meanwhile, powerful surface fleets would slip through and attack the invasion beaches directly. It was a strategy built on deception, timing, and enormous risk. Japanese commanders understood that their carrier air groups were no longer capable of winning an air battle. Many carriers sailed with few aircraft and inexperienced pilots. Yet these ships still carried symbolic weight. They were sent north not as weapons, but as decoys, knowing full well that they might never return. At the same time, battleships and cruisers were ordered into waters dominated by American air power. These ships represented Japan's last concentrated naval strength. Their crews understood the stakes. Many believed this mission would be their final battle, fought not for victory, but for honor and delay. The gamble reflected a deeper truth about Japan's position in 1944. Strategic flexibility was gone. There were no reserves to fall back on. No second chance. Leyte Gulf would not be one battle among many. It would decide whether Japan could continue the war at sea at all. As the fleets moved into position, Japan placed everything it had left on the table. The outcome would determine not just the fate of the Philippines, but the future of the Imperial Japanese Navy itself. And once the operation began, there would be no turning back. When the Battle of Leyte Gulf began on October 23, 1944, it did not unfold as a single engagement, but as a sprawling series of clashes spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. What followed was not one battle, but 4 interconnected battles, each chaotic, deadly, and decisive in its own way. Together, they formed the largest naval confrontation in history. The first blows fell in the Sibuyan Sea. As Japanese surface forces advanced toward Leyte, they were detected by American submarines and reconnaissance aircraft. Soon, waves of U.S. carrier-based planes descended on the Japanese fleet. Battleships and cruisers were hammered from the air. The massive battleship Musashi, one of the largest warships ever built, became a primary target. Hit again and again by bombs and torpedoes, she fought on for hours before finally capsizing and sinking. Her loss symbolized the end of the battleship era, destroyed not by guns, but by aircraft. While this battle raged to the west, a second confrontation unfolded in the Surigao Strait. There, American forces executed a classic naval maneuver that echoed the age of sail and steam. Japanese battleships and cruisers attempted to push north under cover of darkness, only to sail directly into a deadly trap. U.S. battleships, many of them survivors of Pearl Harbor, crossed the Japanese line of advance and unleashed devastating broadsides. Radar-directed gunfire shattered the approaching fleet. By dawn, the strait was littered with burning wrecks. It was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. To the north, Japanese decoy carriers succeeded in their mission. They drew Admiral William Halsey and the bulk of the American fast carriers away from Leyte. Believing he had an opportunity to destroy Japan's remaining carrier force, Halsey pursued, unaware that the carriers ahead of him were largely empty of aircraft and intended to die as bait. This decision opened the door to the most dramatic and dangerous moment of the entire battle. As Japanese surface ships slipped past American defenses, they unexpectedly encountered a lightly armed group of escort carriers and destroyers near Samar. What followed was one of the most extraordinary actions in naval history. Outnumbered American ships, charging battleships many times their size, fighting with desperation rather than doctrine. Across 4 seas, the battle reached its peak. No commander saw the full picture. Decisions were made with incomplete information, delayed reports, and enormous consequences. The scale was unprecedented, the confusion was total, and the outcome would reshape the war in the Pacific forever. Leyte Gulf was no longer a gamble. It was a reckoning. By the time the Battle of Leyte Gulf drew to a close on October 26, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a defeat from which it would never recover. What had begun as an ambitious, complex plan to destroy the American invasion force ended as a catastrophic failure that stripped Japan of its remaining naval power. Leyte Gulf was not just the largest naval battle in history, it was the death of Japan's ability to wage war at sea. Japan entered the battle, knowing it was a gamble born of desperation. Fuel shortages crippled training and operations. Aircraft production could not replace losses. Experienced pilots were gone. Leyte was meant to be a decisive blow, a last chance to inflict such damage that the United States might hesitate or negotiate. Instead, the battle exposed how hollow Japan's naval strength had become. Losses were staggering. 4 aircraft carriers were sunk, sacrificed as decoys. 3 battleships, including the colossal Musashi, were destroyed. 10 cruisers and numerous destroyers were lost. Thousands of sailors went down with their ships. What remained of the once feared Japanese fleet was shattered into fragments, incapable of coordinated action. Equally devastating was the psychological impact. Leyte Gulf confirmed to Japanese commanders that surface fleets could no longer challenge American naval power. Air superiority, radar, logistics, and overwhelming industrial output had rendered traditional naval doctrine obsolete. Even courage and tactical brilliance could not overcome the imbalance. For the United States, Leyte Gulf secured more than a battlefield victory. It ensured the safety of the Philippine landings and severed Japan's access to vital resources in Southeast Asia. Oil from the Dutch East Indies could no longer reach the home islands. Japan's war economy, already weakened, began to suffocate. The battle also marked a grim turning point. With conventional naval power destroyed, Japan increasingly turned to desperate measures. Kamikaze attacks, first employed on a significant scale at Leyte, would become a defining feature of the final year of the war. The Navy that once projected power across the Pacific now relied on sacrifice rather than strategy. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed largely in name only. It would never again mount a major offensive. Its remaining ships would stay in port, lacking fuel, aircraft, and purpose. Control of the Pacific Seas passed permanently to the Allies. Leyte Gulf closed an era. It ended the age of decisive surface fleets and confirmed that modern war belonged to those who could sustain power, not merely display it. For Japan, it was the final acknowledgement that defeat was inevitable. The war would continue. But, at Leyte Gulf, Japan lost the sea itself.